I am heading the research unit of the Ziyama Alkin Infancy Institute here at IDC, and this institute is comprised of two units. There's the clinical unit headed by Yael Segal and the research unit, and we are truly devoted to creating this tight dialogue and two-way bridge between the clinical work and the work that the Infancy Institute does in the field, also with typically developing children in daycare systems, and the research. So just creating this dialogue between the practice, the field, and the research, and hopefully you'll be able to see that kind of framework is what drives the research that I'm going to be presenting today, and hopefully this research will also be able to be translated back into the field. So before I start, I do want to just point out that all of the work that I'm going to be presenting today is done in a project that's in a very tight collaboration with Professor Lindsay Bauman, a close colleague and friend at UC Davis, and of course Dr. Sophie Rousseau, a postdoc in the lab, has greatly contributed to the work that I'm going to be talking about today. So really what we're interested in is just thinking about how the pointer isn't working, but how, what the early caregiving relationships are doing to shape or to influence the infant brain, and what that in turn is doing to support emerging social capacities in the infant. And we are primarily really focusing just on infancy, the first, or the preverbal stages, the first 1 or 2 years of life. And so we're talking about this hypothesized neural mechanistic pathway from social experience with the early caregiver through the brain and to infant social behavior. And so obviously the experience-dependent nature of brain development and the remarkable plasticity of the developing brain, especially during the early years, points towards the fact that these early caregiving relationships should obviously be central in children's brain development. And this mediating model is something that we would obviously hypothesize, but surprisingly, empirical human infant data that directly supports this mediation model of experience, brain, behavior pathway has emerged really mainly from the study of high-risk cohorts reared in contexts of extreme adversity. We're all very familiar, for instance, with the Bucharest Early Intervention Project and with many other cohorts, really just showing the extreme detrimental impact that this early adversity or the signs of neglect has on the developing brain and on the relevant pathological behavior in children, and also revealing the importance of timing. But as Tali Baram so nicely said yesterday, a lot of that data is actually correlational. And so we're talking about correlational data. We're talking about data that is mostly from these extreme adverse contexts. And so, you know, a big question that arises is, what about normative variations in caregiving? And there's really a lot less empirical work that directly talks about this mediation pathway, looking at all three parts of the model of caregiving experiences, brain, and early social development, all in one model, and to really understand how the early caregiving environment might be supporting brain development to support adaptive socio-emotional behaviors. And so all of the work that I'm going to be describing today is really just trying to understand the role that the infant neural circuitry may play in mediating the links between these very early caregiving experiences to later emerging social capacities in normative typically developing children. And someone asked yesterday, what about individual differences? We are very much interested in individual differences and in these normative variations in parenting. And so, in terms of the brain, I'm going to start off with a very general index of brain development, and then as I move forward in the talk, I'll get more and more specific. The first part of the talk, I'll be focusing on resting state data, and the first initial mediator that I'll be looking at is just this very, very initial index or general index of brain maturation, looking at alpha power, and then I'll get a little bit more specific in terms of talking about an index of regulation between approach and withdrawal tendencies, the resting frontal alpha asymmetry, and then for each of these I'll be asking, are individual differences in this EEG power associated with prior early caregiving, and are these individual differences in brain associated with emerging capacities, and is there a mediating role here? And then at the end, I'm going to get into really tackling some of these mechanistic questions, looking at real-time neural patterns during mother-infant interactions face-to-face in which the maternal behavior was experimentally manipulated. And we'll be looking at event-related alpha desynchronization. So, in terms of the resting state has a long tradition of being used as a measure of brain development. It's really just looking at the brain activity when the person is at rest, not doing a particular task. And it's a continuous measure of synchronized firing of groups of neurons in a given frequency. And so more neural circuitry translates into higher EEG power. So when we're looking at resting state in an infant, we can't ask him to rest. So what we do is we basically, in this, sorry, is there an echo or? Okay. In this particular paradigm, we used a mechanical bubble blower so that the infant is just sort of gazing at these bubbles. Importantly, it's not an experimenter blowing bubbles because that's a social interaction. And developmentally, we are particularly interested in the alpha band, and this is, for many reasons, the alpha band is gradually becoming the most dominant resting rhythm. It's consistently been related to cognitive performance. It increases almost linearly with age across infancy, and so all of that really suggests that this is a neural it's an index of neural maturation that might support the coordination of higher order systems, but it's really just this very general index. And so the idea is that individual differences in resting EEG might constitute a particularly relevant outcome to consider when assessing parenting influences on infants' general brain development. And so we're all familiar with these images, I think, from the Bucharest BEIP, the Early Intervention Project, where we see very clearly that early adversity has this detrimental impact on EEG power, with a lot less power in these institutionalized children, and that these have longitudinal effects. Here, this is just an example, and there's many, many, many studies showing these types of findings. In typically developing children, there have been findings regarding associations between resting EEG in the alpha band and social cognitive performance. So Lindsay Bauman, my colleague, and Saba and additional people have found social outcomes that have been related to this, joint attention, theory of mind, and there's just now beginning to emerge really just a couple of studies that associate resting EEG power with normative variations in parenting. So higher quality maternal behavior is generally predictive of or related with increased resting EEG power. And so In the study that I'm going to be talking about today, we had a 4-month home visit in which we were looking at free play interactions coded with Ruth's coding scheme, CIB, Coding Interactive Behavior by Tahl Frenkel, and predicting at 10 months resting state EEG and observed empathic behavior. And so just so that you can get an idea of what this empathy task looks like. Fast forwarded, the experimenter comes in, simulates this pain situation, and then we observe the infant's behavior. This is a very empathic, pro-social infant. She's just about 11 months old. She actually took her bottle, she was looking, inquiring, and then she actually has this approach behavior, approaches the victim, sort of looks at her. We had infants trying to offer the toy bottle, trying to console, or infants that totally did not realize what was going on or did not notice or avoided, withdrew, etc. So we had a lot of variation. And I'm just going to jump straight to this nice result, is that we did find indeed that resting state infant EEG power in the alpha band mediated links between maternal behavior at 4 months, and we were looking at specifically this supportive presence of the mother. It's a very global coding of just how supportive and responsive the mother was, or scaffolding during this free play interaction. And the brain, or the EEG power, was actually mediating links between this supportive behavior and infant prosocial behaviors at 10 months of age. And so moving on to this next index, which is a little bit more specific, looking at the EEG, frontal EEG alpha asymmetry. Just a couple of words about what asymmetry is. We heard about it a little bit this morning. Asymmetry reflects the difference between the EEG power in the left and the right hemisphere, and these individual differences in left and right frontal asymmetry have been related to the capacity to regulate between approach and withdrawal tendencies, or positive and negative emotionality, respectively. And so, in terms of, again, early adversity, we see that right frontal asymmetry is kind of this marker of early adversity. It's been related to maternal depression. In the context of trauma, extreme asymmetry is considered a transdiagnostic marker of pathology, of dysregulated pathological adjustment. And so extreme right asymmetry is related to internalizing, extreme left is related to externalizing, and some of the work that I did during my postdoctoral work with Nathan Fox and Megan Gunner, we found that mediation model in post-institutionalized children. Now, in the context of typically developing children, we see that without trauma history, we see that this relative left frontal asymmetry, this approach tendency, is related with increased social capacities, or this tendency to, we saw in the empathy task, to approach the victim. And so we see better performance on theory of mind tasks, joint attention skills, empathic prosocial behaviors, etc. And so, in addition to that, we have also been seeing some evidence for that first leg of the mediation model, linking between normative variation in parenting and this EEG asymmetry with insecure parenting or attachment parenting being related to right asymmetry, and intrusive, non-sensitive parenting also related to later, and also to concurrent right frontal asymmetry. Now, I just want to stop a second and say that if we are hypothesizing right now about a neural circuitry that's indexing regulation, between approach and withdrawal tendencies, then we might also want to take into consideration individual differences or temperamental differences that are related to reactivity and regulation and to these approach and withdrawal tendencies, so temperament. And we had actually from this sample, some behavioral data showing that using this observed temperamental negative reactivity paradigm that Kagan and Fox have used, we found that there's this risk for high negative reactive babies to display less empathy. They might have difficulty in regulating themselves in front of this distress. And so then we found that behaviorally in this analysis, we found that microanalytic coding of face-to-face interactions, and so the extent to which the mother was contingently responsive to the infant was moderating that link. And so you can see here in this graph that infants with low negative reactivity basically show good empathy capacity. But infants with high negative reactivity, for those infants, the extent to which the mother-infant interactions were, the extent to which maternal behavior was contingently responsive really, really critically mattered in determining their empathic ability. So only those that enjoyed maternal contingent responsiveness, high maternal contingent responsiveness at the age of 4 months, were then displaying high empathy at the age of 10 months. And so taking that reactivity part into consideration also in this hypothesized mediation model, I do just want to say a few more words about the maternal contingent responsiveness. Also thinking about what we heard from Tahl yesterday, we think about this high resolution temporal matching between caregiver and infant as maternal behavior that has high predictability, right? So there's this, it's something that if the infant does something and the mother responds contingently, it's predictable. And so there are lots of micro processes during these face-to-face interactions, and they are thought to foster infant social development through this co-regulation that is happening in an ongoing manner during the face-to-face interactions. And so this temporal matching is thought to be a mechanism of co-regulation, and that would also be supported by the fact that we saw that it's moderating the risk of negative reactivity on empathy. And so taking all of this into account, we found this hypothesized moderated mediation model in which basically maternal contingent responsiveness is predicting left frontal EEG asymmetry, but only for those but that was being moderated by the level of reactivity of the infants, and then in turn, that left frontal EEG asymmetry was mediating the links between the responsiveness of the mother at 4 months and the 10-month empathy. So now that we've kind of given a little bit of some support for this mediation model, looking at these general indices of resting state EEG, we were really interested in tackling the mechanism question and looking at real-time neural response patterns during experimentally manipulated mother-infant interactions. And so, as we heard a lot yesterday and from Andrew Meltzoff and from others, there's recent emphasis not only on the specific caregiver behaviors per se, but on the structure of the patterns of the caregiving dyadic interaction. And the idea is that repeated exposure to contingent exchanges is thought to foster in the infant an understanding of how the self and the other can interact to share experience. And so Meltzoff and colleagues have emphasized the specific type of contingent responsiveness, which is the imitation, as foundational to social, cognitive, and behavioral development. And we've heard about the like-me mechanism, the hypothesized mechanism. When adults imitate infants' expressions and gestures, infants can then make a fundamental connection between the self and other. And I have here some beautiful quotes from Meltsov's paper, including the one that just came out last week, saying that infant imitation actually might serve as a social survival circuit with evolutionary roots and sociocultural consequences. And I do want to point out that we've also heard this idea from Winnicott, who said that actually the precursor to the mirror is the mother's face. And so I think that the best way to see it is just through this type of video. This is, again, that same infant. This is when the mother was told to imitate the infant. And we can see that there's this moment where she suddenly noticed that she's being imitated, and she stops. And then she kind of plays with it, and she does this hypothesis testing, and she kind of says, hey, there's me doing this, and there's you doing that, and you can really, I think, see these fundamental connections that she's making between herself and the other through this imitation. And so we were obviously interested in what's happening in the baby's brain while he or she is being imitated. And as Andrew said yesterday, there is one study that examined what is happening in the baby's brain when experimentally manipulating these two conditions of having an imitator and the person showing a non-contingent behavior. And in this study, they 14-month-old infants were observing an experimenter, so this is in dyadic interactions with an experimenter, either performing actions that he or she were imitating from the infant or were mismatched, and we saw a presentation of those results yesterday, in which they found that the desynchronization of the EEG mu rhythm, which is the alpha rhythm specific to central sites, in the imitation condition was greater than the mu desynchronization in the non-contingent condition. And so we did something similar, but we were doing this with mother-infant interactions. And so we had this free place condition, which we have not yet analyzed. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but I'm going to be telling you a little bit about what we saw in this imitation condition versus the non-contingent condition. So in the imitation condition, the mother was instructed to imitate all of the infant's visible and audible gestures and expressions. And in the non-contingent condition, the mother had an earpiece, and regardless of what the baby was doing, she was just receiving instructions to do gestures and say all sorts of irrelevant sentences. And we decided on what types of gestures to do based on looking at some of these free play sessions and seeing, what usually would make sense. And so I don't think I have time to get into what ERD is, but basically the idea is that the degree of suppression during the event relative to the baseline immediately preceding the event tells us about the degree of brain activity. So it's looking at brain activity that is synchronized to a particular event of interest. And our event of interest, which we have analyzed so far, is looking at the maternal contingent versus non-contingent responses. We're also obviously interested in looking at the infant serves, and we're going to be doing that soon. But just to tell you the results, first of all, we were interested in what brain rhythm are we going to be seeing here? Obviously we hypothesized that we were going to be seeing the mu rhythm, but we wanted to examine that, and we indeed saw this really, really nice significant region effect in which alpha desynchronization was specific in these central sites, and you can see the head models, and that was happening both in the imitation and in the non-contingent conditions. And right now with this sample size, we have not yet seen the group differences. We're interested to see what might happen there. The condition differences. But the idea here is that alpha suppression at central sites, which is a mu-like rhythm, characterizes the infant real-time neural response patterns to maternal behaviors. Okay, I have 5 minutes. So the next question was, are these ERDs, are the alpha suppression that we're seeing in response to these conditions, are we able to predict them by looking at prior exposure of the infant to contingent responsiveness? And we actually found no direct associations between the early experience of contingent responsiveness at 4 months and any of the individual ERDs at 10 months. But we were wondering whether or not associations might be moderated by the infant's early initial ability to just detect contingencies. So it might be that if an infant was born or somehow, we don't know exactly if it's innate or not, but if an infant in those early months did not have the ability to detect contingencies, and so he or she might not have the ability to enjoy what a contingent responsive mother could give her or him in order to foster this suppression in response to imitation. And indeed, we found that associations between maternal contingent responsiveness at 4 months and ERD in the imitation condition at 10 months was moderated by the capacity for social contingency detection measured at 4 months. And so, and this result again was specific to the central sites, which is extremely exciting, controlled for multiple comparisons. And what you can see here, if you look at this graph, is we have maternal contingent responsiveness at 4 months on the X, and then we have central alpha suppression or desynchronization on the right. So more desynchronization is a more negative score, and you can see that only those that have this high contingency, social contingency detection ability at 4 months and had high contingent responsiveness in the maternal mother-infant behaviors at 4 months, they had increased suppression in the imitation condition at 10 months, which is extremely exciting. In addition, we are, and these are really just preliminary analyses right now with just 11 participants, but I wanted to put this idea out there that what might be important to look at is actually the difference score between ERDs to contingent condition or imitation compared or relative to ERDs to the non-contingent. And we can see here that 4-month maternal contingent responsiveness is predicting those ERD scores, the difference ERD score, the delta ERD at 10 months, such that those with higher contingent responsiveness at 4 months have relatively more negative or more suppression towards imitation versus non-synchrony or non-contingent responsiveness in this paradigm. So I'm just going to wrap up. To summarize, what we did in the first kind of initial questions that we had is we directly examined the role of infant neural circuitry in mediating links between early caregiving experiences and later emerging social behaviors. And we found these two mediation models, one with this global parenting measure predicting the global index of maturation, and that in turn mediating links to empathy or prosocial behavior. And then we also found the asymmetry mediating links between the specific maternal contingent responsiveness, which is kind of thought to be a mechanism of co-regulation, and then later infant prosocial behavior. So this really supports, first of all, the idea that normative variations in parenting and overall supportive scaffolding responsiveness, of course, fosters general neuromaturation to support the emerging social capacities. It also supports the idea that this contingent responsiveness is a mechanism for co-regulation, and that also fosters the neural circuitry that is mediating then links towards supporting emerging social capacities. We also found these real-time neural response patterns using this novel experimental paradigm. We found the alpha suppression specific to central sites, so showing that it is a mu-like rhythm, and that kind of rhythm is what characterizes these response patterns to the maternal behaviors. This moderation finding where maternal contingent responsiveness in those infants who were able to detect contingencies early on, that predicts more desynchronization in the imitation condition. That really supports the idea that this repeated exposure to contingent exchanges might be tuning the baby's brain to these types of interactions. And preliminary data point toward the possible importance of looking at these different scores between the two types of ERDs. So our further directions are obviously to continue and examine this paradigm, looking at caregiving influences both on the ERD and the difference ERD, looking at associations between these ERDs and social outcomes, which is something that we have not yet examined. And I think that if we do find particular importance for this difference score, then it would be really interesting to look at this, obviously, in clinical populations such as autism. So I'm going to stop here. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I do just want to say thank you to the Alkin family for the generous support that made all of this possible. To the research assistants and students, I see you all here, who really are extremely devoted to all of this coding and collecting data and recruiting participants. To Danny Katz, the lab manager, to Tahl Frenkel, the administrative assistant, to Dr. Sophie Rousseau, the postdoctoral fellow, who really made a great contribution here, and of course Professor Lindsay Bauman and her team at UC Davis, and to our participants, and to you, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice talk. We'll take one question because we...
So, lovely talk. These longitudinal studies are quite difficult and time-consuming to do, I know. So I don't want to make your life any harder, but I'm wondering if you have thought about an intervention where you try to teach mothers about maternal responsiveness to see if it causes down the road effect, or mindfulness training or something like that.
I think that once we noticed how much these infants are enjoying the imitation condition, and we even were thinking that once parents pick up on that, it might influence their free play. So we at some point decided to just put the free play condition before the imitation condition because people were really, really just enjoying it, and we thought that they might have this implicit intervention of, hey, this is fun, I might do it more. And your results, Tahl Frenkel, I think, yesterday that you were saying where the swinging, and that got me thinking into really thinking about perhaps seeing what an intervention specifically targeted at increasing imitation or contingent responsiveness might do to these types of ERDs. I think both as a intervention research, but also even just as an experimental manipulation to see if we can push these markers around, up and down. Yeah, it's exciting.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So we'll take half hour